Brucham Abayim, and welcome to the third in the continuing series of lectures of shiurim on the Gimel Midos, the 13 principles of exegesis by which the sages, Chazal, Zechar and Ravacha, interpret scripture. In the last two lectures, we have discussed the emergence, the creation of the new paradigm, which is signaled by the Braisa of Rabbi Yishmael. Specifically, that was the Braisa notes that Hillel darshaned 7 meters from the Bnei B'Seira. This important change of paradigm from what we would call something like a hekesh, which means a logical equation of two matters, to what became the shava, which constitutes one of the not only one of the Midos of Rabbi Yishmael, but actually the Midah which Hillel himself used as the Gemara, Tosefta, Yerushalmi, both Gemara, Bava and Yerushalmi relate in front of Bnei B'Seira. And based upon that, the assertion has been that behind every Gzeira Shava lies fundamentally a hekesh, a logical connection between two subjects, two matters, which was transformed into the new proto-text, namely that of the Gzeira Shava, on the basis of which Chazal could go on and actually utilize the hermeneutical principles to in fact derive new halachas, details of halachas, which would not otherwise have been derived using the hekesh. We focused on a Gemara in Daf Lamed Daled in Rosh Hashanah as a explicit case of this. However,
can you just clarify, what is a hekesh?
A hekesh is basically a logical, a rational equation between two things. It's an equation. It's a rational equation.
Independent of the text.
Right. In other words, you take two matters and you equate them. It's an equation.
But I don't need psukim for that. I just need to think.
You don't really need psukim for that. I mean, you need psukim to raise the topics. So the topics are, well, actually, I'll tell you the truth. Actually, in fact, we find Taisef Hakeshim in Chazal even on Maz Janat Yeraisa. In Erev, and the Gemara makes Hakeshim and Kal V'chomesh from Chotza to Mavi, etc., etc. But be that as it may, we take two matters in the Chumash. For example, the hekesh that was used by Hillel, which we see in the Yerushalmi Tosefta, we've got a hekesh between the Talmud Shel Shachar, but the Korban Talmud, and between the Korban Pesach. That was a hekesh used by Shmuel. A hekesh basically means equating two things, saying that two things should be equated, should be equal with regard to a specific law. That's a hekesh, okay? Okay, so now like this. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go actually deep into this matter, and the focus of my discussion is going to be Peidalim and Aleph, because the fact is, Peidalim in the Mesechus of Bava Kama. Okay, so I have open to me, Parak HaChovel, the 8th Parak of Bava Kama, Peidalit, and the Gemara is looking to establish, on the basis of psukim, a very, very famous din. All of you know that the Torah says in Shemais that ayin tachas ayin, that the person injures a person, let's say takes out his eye. So it says the Torah ayin tachas ayin. As we all know, that the Kabbalah that we have from Chazal, right, which is undisputed anywhere, is in fact that the Torah is not telling us that we should chas v'shalom take out the person's eye, the person who's the damager's eye, but rather he has to pay a monetary compensation, right? In other words, we know, right, for sure that something agreed upon, that ayin tachas ayin means, as Chazal would say, mammon. It means money. It's not speaking about taking out the perpetrator's eye. Now, the fact is that the Gemara devotes 2 amudim, almost an entire daf, right, to in fact deriving this from sources, from scriptural sources. There's actually a continuity of the drashas beginning on Pei Gimel Amud Beis, Sof Amud Beis. The Gemara brings a Braisa of Rabbi Triebitz ben Yehuda, and then brings a series of Braisas, in which the Gemara basically tries to prove it from Psukim, to prove it in a what you would call a more of a logical way. In other words, if we have to take out a person's eye and take out his limb, then in certain cases it becomes rather undefined. In other words, how can one limb substitute for another limb, or how does one of the situations of the limbs equal? So in other words, the Gemara tries to justify with Pesukim, but make rational arguments, right? Why ayin tachas ayin cannot rationally mean, it cannot practically mean literally an eye for an eye, but we have to have recourse for money. And the Gemara runs through several brises, several Tanaim, and then several Marayim. Finally, to make a long story short, the Gemara ends up with Rav Ashi. And Rav Ashi learns a Gezerah Shava. Right? So, those of you who have a Gemara in front of you, those of you who don't have a Gemara, nonetheless, it's the first wide line. It's the first of the widest lines of the Gemara. So, the Gemara says, Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Ashi says, and once again, Rav Ashi is the first person who's actually bringing a Gezerah Shava. Up to now, the Gemara has made what I would call sort of like practical arguments. Rav Ashi Omar Asya Tachas Mishor. In other words, we make a Gezerah Shava using the word Tachas. Tachas literally means under, but here it means Tachas in place of, right? From the case of a shor. In other words, we're making a Gezerah Shava from where it says Tachas with respect to a human being to Tachas where it says with respect to a shor, to an animal. Kasiv Hacha, it says here in Shmois, in Exodus, it says Ayin Tachas Ayin. Right? That's set respect to a human being. Uksiv Hasam, it says, right, in another place, right, Shalom Yishalom Shor, Tachas Shor. You have to play an ox for an ox. So, right, so Malahala, just like paying an ox for an ox, is obviously Mammon. No one's killing the ox. In other words, if someone is an ox, the person, kills your ox, you have to kill the other person's ox. Just like this is a payment, a monetary payment. Avkan Mammon. Here too, we're referring to Mammon. So the Gemara has a question. Why are you learning a Gezerah Shava, a tachas using the two words, from shor, in the case of a shor, for an animal? Later, tachas be other. It says, right, respect to others, also is tachas. Like it says, but a sata nefesh, tachas nefesh. And then you should give a nefesh, tachas nefesh, which the Gemara understands to be, at least the Gemara seems to say that the person is referring to actually capital punishment. Malahalan mamish, just like there, with respect to a person, it really means killing the person. Afkan mamish here, you have to say it literally means an eye. I should say mamish means literally. Okay? So the Gemara says like this: Amri, dan nizak nizak, dan nizak nizak. So the Gemara says no. We equate two cases of torts. We don't equate a case of tort with a case of killing, of death, of murder. Whereas Adarabah, the contrary the Gemara says, dan adam and dan adam behema. We should equate the cases of a person, one person from another person, and we shouldn't equate the case of a person from an animal. In other words, the Gemara says there are two connections we can make. We will get a connection between the crime, right, a tort the person murder, or we can make a connection between the person, the object, which is either the person, opposed to the person, an animal. So the Gemara says, so if Ashi father comes up with the word mitachas hasha'ana, right, which in fact actually satisfies both conditions. First of all, you have two cases of torts. Hasha'ana inisa, the bottom chavez. So in other words, there we have a case of a person, a case of torts. Okay, that's what the Gemara ends up. Now, what's interesting is the Tosfos is bothered by this. What about the other Malayim? They didn't have the Gezerah Shava. If the Gezerah Shava is something that a person has a Kabbalah on, what do the other Malayim have to say? So Tosfos has the question. B'Shabbat Malayim Safris. In other words, Tosfos says the other Malayim want to say that the Gezerah Shava said with respect to another din, and in the case of Ayin Tachas Ayin, you can say Gezerah Shava because here Ayin Tachas Ayin is coming to tell me what the actual meaning of the verse is, and not actually coming to equate things. Whatever it is. What I want to do is I want to look at the Nimukei Yosef. Because Nimukei Yosef raises this question: how could it be that I am not aware of this Gezerah Shava? Why? In other words, the question is, why use a practical, rational argument if I have a certified Gezerah Shava, which of course is a Kabbalah Lachal Moshe Misinai, and that is certainly something which if Rav Ashi, who was the later of the Baha'im, had it, certainly everyone before that had it. So the Nimukei Yosef says, right? Well, the Gemara, I'm reading the Nimukei Yosef. It appears in the back of your Gemaras in the standard Shas in Daf Lamed Abel Aleph and the Daf Halif, and the Nimukei Yosef says the following thing. He says, "The Gemara Miyasik of Asher Mammon, B'nechsiv Tachas Tachas." In other words, Nimukei Yosef summarizes the discussion of the Gemara. Rav Ashi learns a Gezerah Shava Tachas Tachas. in which, right, a consequence of which the din of ayin nachas ayin is speaking about mamon, a monetary compensation, and not some other type of compensation. So the Rif asks a question, v'yesh min hatema. Rif asks a question. The kul tanai lo yalfim mahu kla. All the other tanaim, that's interesting. The Taisus calls them Arayim, but there are also tanaim involved in the Sugya too. What about the other tanaim? How come they learn from this pasuk? The ein adam dangas in a shava. Elim came Kabbalah. A person cannot consider it as a Kabbalah. You're telling me Rav Ashi, who's the last of Arayim, he had a Kabbalah, and such illustrious tanaim as a Dustay ben Yehuda, and Gemara brings Rabbi Yishmael, Tandu Rabbi Yishmael, illustrious the Rabchia. All these illustrious Tanaim do not have this Kabbalah, which Rav Ashi, who's the last of Marayim, had. How could it possibly be? So that's the question of the Riv. The Riv is basically asking the same question of the Tosfos.
The Nimukei Yosef.
The Nimukei Yosef is asking the same question. The Nimukei Yosef of the Riv is asking the same question that Tosfos asked. So Upil Shur Meforshim Zal. So the Nimukei Yosef says the Meforshim, the commentators explain, Dahacha Pelusha. This is the way you're supposed to understand this. Kol davar, everything. I'm reading this nice and slow so that everybody can hear this. Kol davar, everything. Sheyoidin boy shekenu, that we know is true. Ha'emes. Anything we know happens to be true. How do we know it's true? We know it's true. Kuvasli, we know it's true and based upon logical and rational grounds. Avol lo nizbana lo yitzmach ben hakosov. But we don't have a direct raya from a pasuk. We don't have a direct proof from the pasuk. In other words, we have to know something is true. Probably, it could be the same tradition, but the tradition might not be the same shava already. But in other words, probably we know it's true. The Nimukei Yosef is referring to the sugya of the Gemara, and there the truth element was actually ascertained on the basis of rational empirical arguments. In other words, anything that I know rationally to be true, conceptually be true, but I don't have a direct proof from a verse. Harishus biyakol adam laduno lavia. A person can actually make a gzela shava. A person can make a gzela shava. Here we know what Yosef is saying is that it is perfectly permitted to, in fact, make a gzela shava, creation ex nihilo. If I know, in fact, actually, that the din is true, that the law is true, based upon rational grounds. What about the general cloud that we know? We saw in the Gemara Pharasaic Judaism, a person, right? A person should make his shava. He has to come to his Rebbe. So he says, that means actually a little bit of a difficulty over here. Right? In other words, well, actually, I tell you, there's a run on Hailadun Lagamre, that's Shekudushat Shem, the din called the Rif. But basically, what I would say is the din of Adam Dun Lagamre means is to create the din anew. But if in fact I've already established that the din is correct, right, then in fact I can actually invoke a Gzela Shava. That's what Nimukei Yosef says. There's a second opinion in the Nimukei Yosef. The Anshe Kedushat Hashem says the second opinion is actually not the proper Gilsa. But I want to focus on this one. Yeah.
Just to clarify, according to the Nimukei Yosef, if I have a Masorah on something as a halach, I can make it Gzera Shava, and the only time I can't.
Well, you said a Masorah. I know
it's
to be true. Right.
The only time I can't. So again, when can I not make a Gzera Shava?
I can make a Gzera Shava if I'm coming to create the din ex nihilo. In other words, for example, I don't know that something is true rationally. So in that case, I can't make a Gzera Shava. This is the Shama, the Sotah we spoke about. If I don't know on other grounds, on empirical grounds, I don't know that the law is true.
So I have a suffix.
I don't even know it's true. I have a suffix. Let's say I don't know the law is true. And therefore, what do? What I do is I see two words in the Torah, and I create a Gzera Shava. That I can't do. But if I already know that the law is true, right? But I don't know how to derive it from a verse.
And I know it's true because I have no suffix.
Right, I have no suffix. Right. I know it's true. Therefore, what I can do is I can come along and create a Gzera Shava. Now, really, what the Nimukei Yosef is saying is really what the Sugya is saying. The Sugya in Talmud Aleph speaks about there's a list of Tanaim and Malayim that establish on rational grounds, on practical rational grounds, why Ayin must mean monetary compensation and doesn't mean literally, taking out the other person's limb, right? In retribution, in response. So, because of this, Rav Ashi can come along and say, look, I'm very, very much convinced. It's clear from your arguments that this law is true, okay? You haven't brought me an absolute proof from the Psukim, as the Gemara, shows these are absolute proof. So therefore what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this Gezerah Shava. That's what Rav Ashi says.
Why did none of the earlier people make Gezerah Shava then? It was clear to them as the halacha.
Oh, so I'm not sure. You asked me a question I don't know. I would hesitate to make a guess, is because it turns out the actual Gezerah Shava that Rav Ashi makes is at the end of Rav Ashi's Gezerah Shava, the same tachas he says mitachas. So there's a me'iri here, and this Gemara that says that sometimes we make a Gezerah Shava, we don't have the exact word, as is, for example, the Gemara in Cholin, Uvaha Koyin V'Shava Koyin. But there, it says the Me'iri, the general one Gezerah Shava is, we're not equating two words, we're creating two subjects. That's what I would hazard to guess. In other words, but in any case, I don't know why, but the Nimukei Yosef says as it says.
If a priori the din is established, why did he do it? What did he?
Well, this is the thing. But this is not the point. The point is this is actually the issue we've been dealing with the last few weeks. Yeah. Namely, Hillel clearly said that it is established. Hillel said you have 200 Kabbalah Psukim that you bring every single year. He had a hekesh, but unless he established a Gezerah Shava. Okay, so in other words, the Midos now is actually, in fact, explicitly stating what we've been saying over the last 2 weeks. I left this for last, of course, that Rabbi Yosef is stating clearly that the Gezerah Shava, when we say Gezerah Shava has to have a Kabbalah, right? It doesn't mean I have a Kabbalah on the actual exegesis, the actual Gezerah Shava. But anything that I know on rational, empirical, or other grounds is true, then one can establish a Gezerah Shava. Okay, that's what Rabbi Yosef is saying this. Now, of course, the Nimukei Yosef is saying this as a rule, as a general rule. He's not saying, well, in this case of Rav Ashi. In other words, he's establishing this as a rule. Right? On the basis of which I would like to say that what the Nimukei Yosef is actually using this Gemara as a type of a precedent that in fact Nimukei Yosef is certainly suggesting that there are other Gezerah Shavas in Shas which are of the same nature. Namely, is that the actual Gezerah Shava was not something which was a Kabbalah, for previous generations, but nonetheless it was a hekesh, or it was an equation, it was an empirical equation that had been established, and the emergence of the Gezerah Shava was merely established at a later point in time. But this does not violate the principle that a person has to have a Kabbalah on a Gezerah Shava. That's what the Yosef is saying.
Did Moshe Rabbeinu get any Gezerah Shavas now? Or everything was at one point rationally true and therefore...
The Gemara says in Tumura that after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu they forgot several things. I think one of them is the Gezerah Shavas. And the Rambam says in Sheva Sheni clearly that Moshe Rabbeinu also was done Gezerah Shavas. But in other words, that's an agadata. In other words, all I'm saying is that we see a principle that the Gezerah Shava rests upon, right, will often rest upon a svara.
Let me just clarify. There's two kinds of Gezerah Shava now according to Nimukei Yosef. There's a Gezerah Shava that I can make myself when it's clearly and obviously true,
right,
and a Gezerah Shava that I have to have as a Kabbalah for my Rebbe.
Well, I don't think we should say two types of Gezerah Shavas. There's actually, all these things like this. He's saying is that where Chazal say that you have to cover Rebbe is you can't create a new Gezerah Shava with 2 words. You have to have, but it doesn't mean I have Gezerah Shava from my Rebbe. In other words, the Nimukei Yosef is saying, what the Nimukei is saying is that when Chazal say you can't make Gezerah Shava unless you have to Rebbe means you can't make Gezerah Shava without something previous to that.
So there's never a Masorah in Gezerah Shava?
I don't think there's never a Masorah. Nimukei Yosef didn't say that. All he's saying is a Gezerah Shava doesn't mean, when it says Gezerah Shava, it doesn't mean that I had my Rabbi told me Gezerah Shava. That's what Nimukei Yosef is saying. Now, is Nimukei saying the 2 types of Gezerah Shavas? Well, in other words, he's not saying this always happens, so I can assume that Nimukei Yosef can assume, probably that it is. But in other words, I'm not interested in the aspect of the Nimukei Yosef. I mean, the Gemara speaks of the Gezerah Moshe Rabbeinu. All I want to establish with Yosef is the point that we're making the last 2 shiurim, right? Is that the going from a hekesh to Gezerah Shava doesn't mean I don't have a Messiah. It's called a Messiah.
And hekesh here means knowing something definitely true.
Right, that's definitely true. Now, how I know it's true? So in the sugya over here, Bava Kama, when Yosef is explaining, we're speaking about knowing it rationally. In other words, the Gemara is making practical, rational, empirical arguments. That's what the Gemara was speaking about. Okay? That's what the Gemara was speaking about. The Gemara, no one says in the Gemara, I heard from my Rebbe this, I heard from my Rebbe that. People basically are taking a pasuk and saying, I take a eye, well, how do you take out the eye? Maybe people have different eyes. In other words, practically there's no way of adjudicating the law. So therefore it must refer to Mama. That's a type of practical argument to be made here in this Gemara. Okay? Okay, is that clear? Okay, fine. Very good. Now, so one of my assumptions, once again, to people have established this, I think that the Nimukei Yosef, in a certain sense, is a proof, a proof, is saying the type of right is a proof to what we've been claiming, that exera shava, right? Exera shava, when a person says I've come from a Rebbe, it doesn't necessarily mean the actual exera shava, but you know what? The person previous to me said something which he has established as being true, independent of an exegesis, and the exera shava comes to correct his exegesis. Yeah. Is
it fair to say that Tosfos argues on this principle? Or is Tosfos non-conclusive?
So like this. First of all, the Tosfos here say that the Gezerah Shava, it's interesting, the Tosfos say the Gezerah Shava is used with respect to a dinner called Meitiv. In other words, what type of property, real estate do I pay in cases when I own a monetary compensation. That's what Tosfos says. But Tosfos seems to make two arguments here. And there's one argument is that they use the Gezerah Shava for Meitiv, and they say that here I shouldn't use the Gezerah Shava because the Shava, right, cannot. In other words, right. In other words, I can't use the Shava to tell me what the simple meaning of the verse says. That's what Tosfos says. But for example, with the Tosfos in Shabbos,
well, is it ever or just in this case?
Well, Tosfos is seeing this as a cloud. The Ein Lohiti Gezerah Shava Ein Echas Aymi Pashte. The mashma ayin mamish ela b'drosh achlisa.
This is not a real Gezerah Shava.
This is right. In other words, this is not you don't use a Gezerah Shava in such a case. That's a
You're saying this version of Ravashi is not.
This Gezerah Shava is right. It's not. No, that's not a real one. The other Marayim feel I should not use a Gezerah Shava. The Gezerah Shava runs against the simple meaning of the verse. That's what Tosfos says.
Because this Gezerah Shava is used.
Tosfos said that's what Tosfos said two things. In other words, Tosfos like this. Tosfos says, I'm explaining Tosfos in 1 second. Tosfos there are two statements in Tosfos. Statement number one, Tosfos says, where Tosfos speaks about Aleph, Dil, Baskal, Ravashim, V'chulei. Tosfos based statement number one is that they take this Gezerah Shava and they use it for the Meitiv. Right. And they feel they shouldn't use the Gezerah Shava in the case of this over here because the Gezerah Shava runs against the simple meaning of the passage.
So that's two.
Wait. That's 2 points. Now, the Tosfos, to understand this Tosfos, I didn't actually intend to be sure the Tosfos, is based upon a Tosfos of Azayrik in Shabbos. I think it's that's not involved. And there, Tosfos is a machlokes who is the kosher eitzim, and the Gemara says there on top of Amar Aleph there that that in other words the other Marayim didn't learn the Gezerah Shava, and Tosfos said there they had a list of a certain number of Gezerah Shavas. In other words, there was a specific list of 150 Gezerah Shavas, and basically, in other words, there was a sarah of how many Gezerah Shavas you use. So basically, they couldn't just reject the Gezerah Shava. There was a sarah to use Tachas. Then because of that, it's what Tosfos is over here. There's Gezerah Shava for Tachas. In other words, they didn't use the Gezerah Shava for this case because it goes against the simple meaning of the pasuk. But they have to use the Gezerah for something because they have a list. So the answer is they filled in the list by using what? By using it for something else, namely Meita. That's the meaning of this Tosfos. Let's find the Tosfos of the Tosfos. In other words, I don't want to really go into this so much.
Tosfos is arguing the Nimukei Yosef.
Yeah, Tosfos is arguing the Nimukei Yosef. Tosfos is arguing Yosef. However, what I want to say is that yes and no. Let me explain to you why yes and no. In other words, Tosfos' contention in Shabbos is that there's a list of Gezerah Shavas, a certain number of Gezerah Shavas. And you can't go beyond the list. So, what if I have a choice between using it for one or another? So I'm going to decide. For example, in our case, you have to go over here. In other words, Ravash, there were 2 ways I could use the Gezerah Shava. I could have used it for Mammon, or could have used it for Etzicha, or taking out the limb. Depends to what I was makashet. At the end, Ravashi resolved it. But if I have a list, but the disagreement with this Gezerah Shava is, in a certain sense, and at the end, how do I make the decision which Gezerah Shava to use? It's going to be Sfar. In other words, if I have a list of Gezerah Shavas, but we're arguing which Gezerah Shava will not include, at the end, what am I resorting to? How? So in other words, what I say is They're arguing and not arguing.
But I have to have a Masorah on
A number.
either the number or the word.
Whatever, whatever. Okay, fine. But in
Whatever.
other case, still at the end, Taisa is going to say, what nails the Gezerah Shava, what establishes it, is the Svara. It's just that Taisa is saying is that in other words, there's a bounded amount of Svaras, etc. I can't give every Svara in the world, but at the end, Taisa is saying I come to my conclusion of the Gezerah Shava based on what I feel is a sufficient svara, a sufficient thing. So, in other words, I'm not sure that Tosfos is arguing completely on Nimukei Yosef. I think this is what's called Midas Mixes. As is, by the way, my dear listeners, in all Machlokas Rishonim, since Rishonim are arguing, and since there are points for against each one, there's always a common conceptual agreement on the basis which they form an opinion. So that's what I would say. But the Nimukei Yosef says it explicitly. That's the important thing I want to say. Yeah.
I want to assume that there was one true. I want to go to the
Tosfos because I'm going to the Tosfos. We bring up the Tosfos too. By the way, we bring up the Tosfos too. I don't want to make it the shiur in the Tosfos. Okay, but you can look at Hazerek. There's a famous Humikoshes Eitzin, Rabbi Akiva, Tzarech Stila. People ask this question. So, I can study love. Okay, fine. Now. Okay, now that we've established at least the Nimukei Yosef and Midas Mixes the Tosfos intrinsically agrees that what generates the Gezerah Shava is a hekesh or a svara, then I want to focus a little bit more on the sugya too, in Bava Kama. Okay? But Baruch Hashem, Baruch the Sayan, we have actually a kind of the Vasayala, the Nimukei Yosef. And interesting, the Nimukei Yosef says, Kasim HaMaforshem, which means the Yosef is not like a Das Yochid, but actually the Yosef is actually speaking for the Meforshim, interpreters. It seems that this was actually and by the way, the Chagav in the Me'iris I mentioned before says that even though it says Mitachas, the Yosef says that the Me'iris says that Gezerah Shava is not only a question of two words, it's actually a question of two inyanim. So the Me'iris also say something very similar, that we're equating two subjects and not actually two words. Okay, now, but I want to look a little bit more in the sugya. Question is, it's very interesting that the Gemara brings so many proofs that ayin tachas ayin is money. I mean, it's there are not that many sugyas that bring so many proofs that the din is true. Usually we have one drasha, maybe two drashas, that's it. But to bring the entire own of Gemara, 5, 6, 7 opinions. In fact, actually, in the Yilmud Beis Ben Aleph, we have a whole list of arguments. Now, what types of sugyas do we have still to this? Is that the Gemara is making a claim, and the Gemara just brings one after another. Well, for example, in Menachos Samach Vav, Brachas HaShabbos, as is well known, the Tzdukim claim the Brachas HaShabbos meant literally, it says in the Torah you're supposed to bring the count of Tfilas HaOyim and bring the Korban Oyim in Brachas HaShabbos, the day after the Shabbos. And the Tzdukim, the Sadducees, were of the opinion, this is, a lucid Gemara, you don't have to go to the library for this. Rabbi Menachos tells us in Samach Vav, right? Samach Vav, Samach Vav, right? That they learned Brachas Shabbos meant Shabbos Bereshis, and Chazal, of course, argued and claimed that Brachas HaShabbos, in fact, actually means Shabbos refers to Pesach, and the Gemara brings many opinions. The Gemara decides which opinions are more refutable than others. At the end, the Gemara brings a limud. The Gemara claims that this opinion cannot be refuted, that two ways cannot be refuted, others can be refuted to a certain extent. And I always say, it's interesting that Rambam says in Perek Beis that Hilchos Shabbos that we have especially did in the Rambam. Kabbalah says that in the case of a life, in the case where life is threatened, a person is, God forbid, whose life is being threatened, then we're allowed to desecrate the Shabbos. The Rambam brings V'chaypem, and Rambam mentions something interesting. The Rambam says, and not like the minimum of the Tzdukim will argue that you're not supposed to desecrate the Shabbos. I always raise the question. Where do we see in the Shas and the Tzdukim argued on the drasha of Chaybem. So I claim that if you look at the Gemara in Pei Gimel and Yuma, where the Chaybem is brought, there's also a sugya which very, very much parallels the sugya in the Nachais. Namely, one drasha after another, and then the Gemara decides what drasha is irrefutable. So I claim that Rambam, on the basis of the equation between the two sugyas, understood, as a matter of principle, that where the Gemara brings many opinions, right, until we come to a point where the Gemara proves something, it's usually a clue that the interpretation of the pasuk was being argued against Chazal. Okay?
Rambam had his own student to do with Sotah.
Yeah, right.
Just,
That could possibly be true. It's very interesting. You should know something. The Rambam in the Chovel HaMazik also spends 3 halakhas explaining how to get it from Sukkim. I'm not sure that's because the Karaim, of course, he's echoing the Gemara. But in any case, I think it can be established, right? I mean, it makes sense. It certainly makes sense to establish the fact that bringing one opinion after another until a finally end of Avashi creates a shava, right? And that's the buck stops there, right? Is that in fact it must have been, and the Rambam emphasizes that the Pesukim Rachel which we see now. In other words, it must be that there must have been opposition from certain anti-Chazal quarters, from Sadducee quarters, right, to this interpretation of the pasuk. And we know, I think till today, I think the Muslims, actually chop off your hand. Now that's what I heard. But as a little kid, I grew up with that, and it was true. Like a lot of things I grew up with, they actually chop off your hand.
A month ago, they did that in
They
Nigeria.
did. Yeah, okay, fine, very good.
Nigeria.
So if the Nimukei Yosef is somehow using this sugya as you would say as a basis for making what he calls a klal, a zera shava. That's what the Yosef says. On the basis of the shikha, we see a klal, a general rule. It doesn't say that zera shava is different than zera shavas. This is, a new time. It's maybe a smachtik or rashi. Yosef uses this sugya as a precedent, as a important example of what goes on in zera shava. He uses this example to apply to other cases too. I wanted to add that it might be, we have an interesting thing. What about the Sotah? Would the Sotah agree with the Gzeira Shava? In other words, why do you tell the Sotah it's a Gzeira Shava? What will he say to that? So, Baruch Hashem, there's a Gemara in Sotah, I'm going to give on the base. The Gemara is not speaking about anything you call like legal. It's speaking about whether Eloi Nemo is Shem. But the Gemara brings, so it turns out is that the Gemara brings a rayas like a Gzeira Shava that Eloi Nemo is Shem. Eloi Nemo is Shem. And the Gemara says, I'm quite from the Gemara Gilon base in Sotah, following 53 side B. Tanya, Omer Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yosef. Tanya, Draisa. The Dom is there, on this thing. Ziyafti Sifei Kusim. I disproved the Kusim. Amarti Lahem, I said to them, Ziyafti Tiraschem. In other words, you made false your Torah. Your Torah is a forgery, it's false. Well, I need to be some clue. Right? And you don't get anything. In other words, you made a whole way of interpreting the Torah, and look what you did. You couldn't come up with anything. Shatem Omer Lemer Eshchem. You say Lemer Eschem. Afalo B'nei Lemer Echem. But however what? Anu Lamdanu Gzeira Shava. Atem Bama Lemadatu. In other words, how do you learn Eshchem? We learn from Gzeira Shava. In other words, the method of Yosef seems to be implying is that a major, the important difference between Chazal, where Chazal learned from verses and between the Kusim, and I guess Kusim, Stukim, in other words, they weren't invited to Chazal, to the oral law. is that we don't need to have a shava. You don't have a shava.
Rabbi Yosef is one of the people that listed Midos.
No,
It's 36. It's 36 Midos.
Right, could be. Okay, that's Rabbi Yosef, right? I can remember.
It is Rabbi Yosef.
I didn't think about it. There's Rabbi Yosef Glili, but maybe there's Rabbi Yosef Glili here. Could be.
Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Yosef Glili. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Could be. Think about it. Maybe next week we'll make some schayra from that. Now, the Gemara, the Gemara is a very, very, the Gemara doesn't say this derech agav. In other words, the Gemara actually is a very, very, it doesn't just say this, haphazardly, coincidentally, I would say. But it seems that the Kusim did not accept the notion of Gezerah Shava. So I want to claim we have here an interesting fact. The Gezerah Shava of Hillel, for sure, was not something probably that the Stukim would accept. The Stukim, for this Gemara clear, the Stukim don't accept the notion of Gezerah Shava. The Stukim have to find some other way of digging this out of the text. Some scholarly or linguistic or whatever way of digging out the text. But they didn't accept the notion of a Gezerah Shava. Which, in a certain sense, in my opinion, spells out the fact that the establishment of a new text is not only, Rafael, you asked the question, why was the need to establish a new text? Well, it is true that Gezerah Shava does create powerful tools, but at what times? But, what prompts us to decide at one time or another? I always thought that, for example, the establishment of the Mishnah over the Drashas, Rebbe's Mishnah, I always thought that the significance of establishment of the Mishnah is that it put an end to the Drashas. And I would think that part of the reason is that people already were making Drashas against the authority of Chazal, and the more Drashas and the more methods we make somehow might lead us away from what we feel is the halachic truth, the tradition we have. And because of that, now the tradition becomes consolidated within the Mishnah. The Mishnah is firmly established as halachas that we accept. This is actually what Rashi says, Lo Gimel Bezin Bava Metzia. Rebbe, checked out which Mishnahs were authentic or not authentic. That's what Rashi says. Meaning that there were a lot of drushes at that time that were non-authentic. And on the basis of that, Rebbe put an end to the drushes, at least original drushes. And the Teresh B'Al Peh, the era after that was the era of Gemara, would now be generated based on Mishnayos. If you look in Yeshima number 2, there's an entire discussion on that. Could it be that we have the same thing over here too? In other words, the Kusim, or the Stukim, with their competing svaras, or competing drashas, it was necessary to establish a text which would, in other words, go beyond. The text of Gezerah Shava, once it's established, is not subject anymore to to any type of a critique, a legal critique, because it's a Gezerah Shava, a Kabbalah by Rabbi. In other words, once you say a svara, I can say a svara against you. But once you say Gezerah Shava, like Bava Kama said, okay, we're Bava Kama, Gezerah Shava. In other words, the creation of the new text, right, preserves, consolidates, and preserves the Messiah, inoculates it, right, from either logical or hermeneutical critique, right? And that's what, in a certain sense, sustains the oral law in the face of those who deny it. So, what I want to claim is, in this sugya, clearly we see that going on. In other words, the many opinions that are being offered, right, to prove what we knew to be true, ayin tachazayin, but still always, one could always, as the Gemara does, so raise a point which puts it into question. But once Rav Ashi makes a Gezerah Shava, that's it. The sugya ends there. The buck, the rabbinical buck ends there. Because the Gzeila Shava is a text, a model, right? Which is beyond, it's not subject to any type of critique. It's two words that are equal, that's it. I have a sign on it too. So, could it be that you ask the question, why the Sheva Midos? The answer is, it could be, right, that in fact, the time of Hillel, at that time, the Stukim had very much questioned the Masech of Chazal, and in other words, if I use a means of argument, let's say Bava Kama, then they would have argued in the same way as the Bnei Seder argued. I can always find points to place the Bava Kama in doubt. But once I say it's a shava, that's it. There's no more commensurable conversation.
How hard is it to offer an alternative to shava? We find in the Gemara all over the place that this one's like this, and he's Darish it.
Yeah, but that's among Chazal.
So,
in other words,
it isn't true that when someone states that it's a shava, that's it.
no, but each person is claiming as a Messiah on it. In other words, that's what Tosfos said. There was people arguing that a shava.
So really, the point is that the halacha has a Messiah, not that it has a shava. The point is that this halacha has a Messiah.
Oh yes, but I want to more to know. But the Messiah can be a svara that's assailable. Once I couch in the lashon of the Gzeila Shava, right? So therefore, it's not subject to any type of a critique of a rational critique.
The Messiah, not
right. This is correct. This is a little bit right. But when I take the Messiah, and I freeze it.
So it seems to be saying that Messiah wouldn't be credible without a Shava.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Right, that's what it is. That's like what it is. So, for example, just like no one would go to a Mishnah and say, well, I disagree with the law, let's go dash that person differently. We only say mina hanamilai. So here too. In other words, so what we have here is that I think there's two factors here which are important. In other words, in the emergence of a new genre, there's always really two opinions. What generates it? So one opinion, like for example, like the Chazon Ish in his letter to Rabbi Triebitz, he comes down the Chazon Ish speaks about that the reason we can't argue on the Gemara is not like the Malchanan at least tried to suggest that we can't get all Chazon together, but rather because there was a Sadducees, which could possibly be that this is part of what was being about over here, that we don't, Svaras are suspect in the later generations. There was the earlier generations were capable of equating things using their intellect. We don't come to them, therefore we freeze, we make a Gzeila Shava. Alternative, you could say, is that, in other words, just like some people that write down the Mishnah when they attempt to preserve the Torah Shabbat, right? The Gemara in the same way. So too, through the Yud Midas, in which there's a rules. In other words, there's internal rules. In other words, no one's questioning the logic of the midah. It just questions how I use it. No one questions the basis, no one questions the empirical basis of the midah. Right? Like, for example, in physics, you use the Schrodinger equation, Newton's equation, the Dirac equation. No one questions how he got to the equation. You assume the equation. Now it becomes part of a new paradigm until someone decides the equation is no good anymore. What I'm saying is that, in other words, here too, once I create a model which has its own rules, right? So I'm no longer concerned with, the empirical road towards that model. It becomes an internal thing. Now we might disagree among each other, it's how I use the rules. We'll speak about them. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel, is it Mufti B'tzad Echad? Mufti B'tzad Todem? Klal Pater versus Midos with Midos. I might argue on how to use the rules. But what I have is, I've internalized things. There's internal rules. I'm not subject to an empirical critique. Someone can't come along and critique me because I have internal rules. You want to critique me, you have to use the same model, and you have to agree with my rules. So, in other words, what I want to claim, and I'm basing myself on the Sotah and Bava Kama, what I want to claim is that the role of the Gezerah Shava is a internalizing. It's a bastion. By internalizing the rules, by creating a model with its own rules, so now I've incubated the oral law for any what? Insulated, or maybe what? Insulated. I've insulated the oral law, right, from the empirical critique, and this ensures its survival.
It's not really, it's not the Chazal way of saying Azayas.
Azayas, right? Anyway, so that's, in other words, I think that, and so if we speak about really, Beis Hillel and Bnei B'Seira, that's what he was doing. In other words, the confrontation of Hillel with Bnei B'Seira, it might be that Bnei B'Seira, in other words, they had an answer to Tzlukin. But it was very interesting, and I want to go back again, this Gemara in Sotah picks on Gezerah Shava. Now, we can ask me, what about Kaval Chomer? Kaval Chomer is rational, but Kaval Chomer ends up in a Binyanav. In other words, Kaval Chomer has an out, it comes with a Binyanav. Once they get to the Binyanav, you can forget about the Kaval Chomer anymore. We'll speak about this. But in other words, this I want to claim is the important thing. Now, yeah.
Is it possible that the Machlokes of Bava Kama was Erev Pesach Shchayos b'Shabbos?
Yeah.
And the Strikim always wanted Pesach to be on Shabbos.
What?
The Strikim always wanted Pesach to be on Shabbos. So the Machaz of Shabbos. So if they were challenging it, it could be that they were trying to...
No, but they want Shabbos voracious, or maybe. I don't know. You raised a good point. I didn't think of that. Whatever it is. But I was checking for Pesach on Shabbos, though. No, I was checking on Friday.
That's what
they want to
want.
it. They
right,
want
that's what Strikim would want.
Ah, that's an interesting thesis. You could probably write a thesis on it. You
Thank you
gotta
very much.
on that.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I don't think so, because I think that what they established that I gave it the Gemara in Menachos. In other words, it was necessary that Pesach fall out on Shabbos, or just that it's any Shabbos.
They said that the whole Gemara Rosh Hashanah, they're trying to mess up the Kiddush HaChodesh so that Pesach will fall and doesn't.
The Fiches. I'm not sure. I have to think about it. But that would be very interesting. Okay, fine. Okay, in any case, so now what we have over here is this point. Now, I want to make a second important point too about this Gemara. Well, among this Gemara, there is of Yosef and the Gezerah Shava. This is saying
which Gemara?
I'm sorry, let me get a little bit in Sotah. And there he says, Ziyatim Teraschem. He says, we learn from Gezerah Shava. But how do you learn it? Give it Gezerah Shava. Now, it could be on the answer you just asserting that we have the techniques and we should learn something. We don't have to resort to. You have no way of arriving at the conclusion. Now, the fact is that, in other words, how the Kusim know this? You have no way. How do you learn it? How do you learn it? There's perhaps another way of understanding it is that, in other words, the Kusim, right? How would you learn it? Is that the Kusim there's an element too, an issue of the Kusim, is that the law of the Kusim, the Kusim don't have changes in paradigms. They have either the Sotah, the Kusim, the Stukim, don't have an interesting notion of changes in paradigm. What's interesting is that this comes out, very interesting enough, is in Seder Olam Rabbah. Seder Olam Rabbah speaks about that Alexander the Greek, the very interesting about Rabbah, Alexander the Greek, comes to Yerushalayim. And it says, he came to Yerushalayim, so it's interesting. It says, Atkan, right? You hear the Nevi'im. Right? Mikan va'elech hat tishma divrei chachamim. Okay, now, if Tzaddik, I think, has a lot to say about this. We won't put on Tzaddik right now. But we see that, in other words, there is a notion, I'll use a Pharasaic concept, is that just like in other words, the Greeks bring a new culture, Greek thinking certainly revolutionized what the instincts of the world. So it's a Zulu Mazu, in the same way too. In other words, the change from the Vua to Chachma, right, is coming at the same time that Alexander Magdon, right, introduces Greek culture to Yerushalayim. However I learn, the fact is, and Sotah says explicitly, this next week we're going to go into it in detail, but we see that the Kusim are backwards, they're primitive. The Stukim are primitive. They only know one way. In Chazal, there is, in Yiddishkeit, there is a concept of changing paradigms, and I'm not making cause and effect statement, at least not at this point, but the very fact is that the Seder Eidim Rabbah, right, is certainly making a commensurability between the introduction of Greek culture and the change from the Vua to Chachma. And this leads us to a very interesting issue, because the Vua, of course, doesn't use Midos. Like the Gemara says, the Psachim, made in the Vim, but the Vua is really associated more with Hanhaga. We've spoken about this. The Vim don't use Midos. What they use Midos? None of the Vim. They're only Chachamim. The Vua works on inspiration, Messiah, Minig, Takanas the Vim, Minig the Vim. No one speaks about a drush. Ain't Novi Rosh in the Chadish Boy Dova. Now as the Ram said, Novi can't make a drasha. Using a Midas, it's in contradistinction to what a Navi is to make a drasha. He's making a drasha, he's not making it a Navi already. So, what's interesting is, very interesting is that in this Seder Eidim Rabbah, we see that and this is what I say the tripartite of in history is not only is there a obviously clear Yigdus HaDavis, we don't rely now this is part upon empirical scholars. And not only is there an onslaught from the Stukim, but at the same time, El Yisrael, is inundated with Hellenistic culture, and the Greeks certainly had their ways of interpretation of Scripture. And we see that at this point in history, Chazal, at least, are formulating what are the Yud Gimel Midos, which is rather clear that there are certainly analogies of these things, right, in Greek and Roman rhetoric. There are several distinguished scholars who devoted articles in which, it's clear that there are very, very important parallels, right? In my opinion, they're not really parallels. We will speak about that, but there are certain seeming parallels between the Yud Gimel Midos and between the works of Cicero and the Greek historian in interpreting Scripture. And this is the third thing, which I think is very, very interesting. We speak about the Yud Gimel Midos time of Hillel. It's already based on Mikdash. There's the influence. Actually now it's Rome, but of course, it's Greek, and it's clear. This is not me. I'm saying it's clear that there's a conjunction of these two things. And what is the difference of that? So, in Mitzvah Shem, next week, we're actually going to go a little bit deeply into this topic. You'll only hear this on Pharasaic.com, of course in a kosher way. And the two articles we're going to focus on is I think David Dalby of Oxford University and Professor Shaul Lieberman, in which actually we're going to actually make an attempt to actually understand the Yud Gimel Midos in light of what was the surrounding culture, and using the Seder Rabbah with these artists, how we understand one or the other. But until then, from an understood place in Yerushalayim, Kodesh, Kol Tov, be well.